Well, thank you, Crystal. Thanks for being here. This afternoon at 2:20, they're going to do that alert, emergency service alert. So if you're here this afternoon, we might have an adventure. This morning we'll be all quiet and calm, and everything will be okay. So I was 3 years old, and a very sad and unnecessary thing happened in our family. I got a little brother. Now, did I say I needed a brother? Did I want one of those things? Have I ever once asked for a brother? No. Well, they got him anyway. Now, here was for me what the worst thing was about having a little brother. When I was a little kid, I was very busy. And I would be right in the middle of doing something that was totally educational. And all of a sudden, my mother would show up and she would say, "Oh, there you are. I need you. I need to go hang out the clothes. You come and watch the baby." I would think, you are a grown-up woman, and you cannot see that I am busy. I do not have time to watch your baby. You wanted the little thing, I guess you can watch it. She would say, "Come on now, you're my only little helper. Come and watch the baby." And I'd think, okay, I'll watch him. Maybe somebody will come to the door and they can have him. I hated watching the baby. Now, I have a little cousin named Andy. Andy and I were born the same year. I'm just a little bit older than he is, but we're essentially the same age. And you understand, since we're cousins and not brothers, we liked each other. And sometimes I would go over to his house and play all day and even spend the night, or he'd come over to our house and we'd play all day and he'd even spend the night. Well, Andy and I got to be 5 years old. So when we're 5, my little brother Joe is 2. And one day his mama had to go somewhere all day long, and so she brought him to leave him at our house all day. Well, as soon as my mama let us go outside, we had a plan. We went around the house and out to where my daddy's garden was, because right there was everything we needed. Right there was dirt, tools you could dig with, the water hose, and my mama couldn't see us. So we dug a great big hole, and we started filling it up with water, and then putting dirt back in it, and filling it up with water, putting in more dirt, water, dirt. We made this gorgeous pit of mud. And then we were using that mud to build little roads all around that would bake in the sun. And it was hard work, because the first thing we had to do was get rid of the grass in the yard before we could do that. All of a sudden, here came my mama. "Oh, boys, there you are. I was looking for you. I need to go way back in the garden and pick beans for our supper. You boys come in the house and watch the baby." My cousin Andy looked up and he said, "We're busy." My mama said, "Not anymore, you're not. You come and watch the baby." Now, we started walking back toward the house with my mother. Now, my cousin Andy, he was only 5 years old like I was. But even when he was 5 years old, you know what he had? He had a fully developed little smart mouth. And he looked up at my mother and he said, "Aunt Lucille, I have a question, and I bet you don't know the answer." She said, "What's the question, sweetheart?" Wasn't she nice to him? He said, "What do you have to do to get fired?" She said, "What do you mean get fired?" He said, "What do you have to do to get fired from watching a baby?" She looked at him and she said, "Little mister, you get that out of your mind. You cannot get fired from watching the baby. You boys are my only helpers. I depend on you. And besides that, you both know deep in your hearts that you love him." We had no choice now, did we? Well, we went in the house with her. She took off to go to the garden to pick the beans. And there in the kitchen, down in his little playpen, there was my little brother. Now, it was not a modern playpen. You know, it was not the kind with that little meshy stuff on the sides and little silver pipe. No, no, no. This was an old-time square wooden playpen, the kind that had little bars like a jailhouse for babies. And we looked at him down in the baby jail, and we thought, okay, what are we going to have to do? And about that time, we realized with my mama way out in the garden, she could not hear us. So we decided to play our favorite game, Make the Baby Cry. It was an excellent game. We played it with cookies. We got the cookies and we got down in the floor and we watched my little brother Joe watching us eat cookies. His little arms would come out through the bars. He'd be begging, give me. We'd figure out exactly how long his arm was. We'd hold a cookie up till he could almost get it, and then we'd eat the cookie. And he would cry every time. It was great. Well, we ran out of cookies, so we had to play something else. So we started to play fishing for babies. He would lose a little toy, out of his playpen, and he'd want us to pick it up and toss it back in for him. Well, we'd pick up the little lost toy, but before we'd toss it back, we'd tie a string on it. And then we'd get the other end of the string, we'd throw the toy back, he'd try to grab it, we'd jerk it out again. In and out, fishing for babies. It was great. Well, then we got tired of that, and we told him he had plenty of toys. He could stop bothering us and play with his toys. He started crying, no, play with me. I said, hush, even your voice is ugly. Play with your toys. I know what to do. Play punching bag with your little rattle. I'll fix it for you. I have to explain this part. He had this little rattle. They don't make them like this anymore, I think because of us. It was like a little clown head, a little plastic clown's head, and it had little beans or something inside, so it would go rattle, 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 rattle. But instead of like most rattles, with a handle on it, right where the little clown's neck would be, there was a little steel spring about that long, and then a big white rubber suction cup on the bottom. You could stick it on the tray of his high chair and he could play rattle, 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 rattle. Stick it on the Formica tabletop, rattle, 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 rattle. Going somewhere in the car, stick it on the window, rattle, 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 rattle. And one day my daddy picked it up and he stuck it on the cabinet and he said, look at there, you got a punching bag. Go beat it up. And my little brother crawled over there, and all afternoon he went, pow, 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 pow. I thought that will keep him busy. So I got the rattle. We pushed the playpen up against the cabinet. I reached through the bars, stuck it on, and I said, now, punch a bag. He crawled over there, and he went, pow, and it fell off. And that's when I realized I'd forgotten to do the most important thing when you're going to stick one of those suction cups on something. I forgot to wet it, right? So I picked it up out of the floor and just went, and I started to stick it back on the cabinet. Now, everything from here on is my cousin Andy's fault. Because he said, stick it on his head. Well, we picked the best flat place we could, and we stuck that slobbery rattle, chong. That little clown's going, doodle, 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 doodle. And my little brother's going, and Andy and I are rolling over in the floor laughing our heads off. It's the funniest thing we ever thought of. Well, my brother Joe thought that was funny for about 2 minutes, and then it started to hurt. And he started pulling on it. Help, get off, it hurts, get off, get off. Well, We tried to get it off. It wouldn't come off. And we pulled and we pulled and we pulled. And I would hold Joe and Andy would pull. Joe's little neck was just getting longer and longer and tears spurting out of his eyes. And finally we got Joe to hold on the bars of the playpen. And Andy and I both got hold of the rattle. And we pulled and we pulled it. We pulled so hard and all of a sudden it went pow. And when it popped off, that child was not normal. Right there was a big red sucked up circle and it would not wash off. I thought, ooh, we're in trouble, but I know what to do. All we got to do is put some of my mama's makeup on it. Well, we went to look for her makeup and we couldn't find it because the last time we had been over there, she had hid it from us because we were playing chemistry set with her makeup. So we were searching up and down in the bathroom, looking everywhere. All of a sudden, Andy said, let's try this. Did you ever get insect bites or poison ivy and put pink stuff on it? It was a big, large bottle of pink calamine lotion. Andy said, babies are kind of pink. This is kind of pink. It'll probably work. So we shook it up and got some cotton and we dabbed it on that place and it covered it up, but now it was pink. So Andy said, put it all the way across and she won't notice it. So we painted him pink all the way across his forehead, right down to there. Now he looked like an old two-tone Chrysler product. Andy said, keep putting it, keep putting it. We kept putting the pink stuff, kept putting the calamine lotion, kept putting it. In a little while, the whole bottle was empty. And everywhere that my little brother wasn't wearing a diaper, he was a solid, bright pink baby all over. Right then, my mama came back in from the garden. She had a big bucket of beans. She was going to sit on the porch, and string the beans and break the beans. She said, how's the baby? Fine. Did you boys watch him? Yeah. Did you play sweetly with him? Yeah. Do I need to check on him? No. I better check on him. She walked in the kitchen, and when she saw that shining pink baby, she just hollered, he's sick. And she grabbed him up in one arm and put her hand on his forehead to see if he had a temperature. And she held that hand there just long enough that when she moved it, all that pink stuff came right off on her hand. And there was the big sucked up place. You ever notice how mamas can get mad in a hurry? She totally lost her punctuation. What in the world have you done to my baby? I can't turn my back on you for 10 seconds. I cannot. I'm as mad as I can be. I'm as mad as a wet hen. What in the world have you done? I thought this is going to have a bad ending, a bad ending. And then we couldn't believe what we heard. She was going on. She said, look at me when I talk to you. Don't look away from me when I'm talking to you. I'm talking straight. You two boys, you two boys, you two boys never get to watch him again. Ta-da! We did it. We got fired from being the babysitter. And from then on, no matter what we were doing, we never again had to stop and watch the baby. After hearing a lot of stories about my little brother, sometimes people come up and say, is your brother alive? Is he okay? My wife Trish and I will be having dinner with them Monday night, so he's just fine. We'll be there. And the worse the stories are, the better. And Andy's okay too. Andy's just fine. We're all okay. We're just fine. Good. So when I was a little boy, the first stories I really ever remember were the stories that I heard when we would go visiting on Sunday afternoons. maybe to my grandmother's house, but a lot of times to my Uncle Frank's house. My daddy was number 8 of 13 children. And right in the middle, there were 4 boys in a row. There was Uncle Moody, Uncle Harry, my daddy, and Uncle Frank. And they were like a little sort of subset family right in the middle. And Uncle Frank had ended up being the person who took over the farm when my grandmother died. He didn't mean to. But she died in 1943, and Uncle Frank was working in the shipyard in Wilmington during the war. And all the other brothers and sisters got together and said, what are we going to do with the farm? Let's put it off on Frank. And that's how he became the farmer with the farm my daddy had grown up on. So we'd often go out there because that was the growing up place. And I heard story after story after story after story about things they had done when they were little boys. It was about 1910. And those boys would have been like 12, 11, 10, and 9 years old. And way up in the end of the summer, they were helping their daddy, my granddaddy, do what they always called making hay. My dad said they had a big team of blonde Belgian workhorses. And they would mow the hay and then hope that it could dry in the sun for a day or two without getting rained on. And then they'd rake it up into windrows. And then they'd rake those windrows up into little piles like that. And then they could throw a chain around that pile and stand on it and ride it with the horse pulling it back to the barn, where there were 2 gigantic poles, even when I was little, where they would get in there with the pitchforks and start building the haystacks. So they would slope off and turn the water, through the wintertime, and the cows would eat around till they looked like mushrooms, because the cows would eat around the bottom of them till finally the hay would come on down, and they'd eat hay all winter. Well, it was so dry there at the end of the summer that after they worked in the hay all day, they would have hay everywhere. They'd have hay up their nose. They'd have hay down inside their clothes. They'd have hay in their hair. They'd be itching all over. They had an outhouse, no bathroom, so they couldn't take a bath. And what those boys would do is they would walk almost a mile to the Pigeon River, where they'd take off all their clothes. I liked that part of the story. They'd take off all their clothes, and they would shake them and beat them and shake them and beat them and shake them and beat them. And then they'd jump in the river, and they would scrub with sand, along the edge of the water. They'd scrub with the sand till they got all the itch scrubbed off of them. And then they'd come back out and run around till they got dry, and then beat their clothes some more, and then put them back on. And that way, they didn't itch to death all night after that. Well, one day they had been working in the hay, and at the end of the hay, they got ready to go to the river when Uncle Frank, my daddy said in their family, Uncle Frank had a special job. He was in charge of bad ideas. Every family has one of those now, don't they? Yeah. He said to his brothers, it is too far and too hard to run all the way to the river to just jump in. What we need is a swimming hole at home. They said, what's that? He said, I read about it in a book. It's what rich people have. It's a big hole in the ground behind your house, and it's full of water. And anytime you want to, you just go back there and jump in it. Let's dig one. And my daddy said, Frank, that sounds dangerous. I don't believe Mom and Daddy would let us do that. And Frank said, that's why we're not going to tell them. We'll dig it and fill it up with water, and then when we show it to them, they'll like it so much they'll jump in. Well, my daddy said he told his brothers he would watch them get in trouble, but he would have nothing really to do with it. Well, they went out to the barn, and they gathered up all the tools you could dig with. They'd get a spade and a shovel. They got a mattock and a pickaxe, everything you could get in the dirt with, a hoe. And they dragged it out behind that house. And I remember this from when I was little. There was a big round rock that kind of blocked your view when you looked out from the kitchen. And so they decided to build a swimming hole on the other side of that rock so their mama, my grandmother, wouldn't see what they were doing. So they went around there and they marked off a big place on the ground. Late in the summer, it hadn't rained. That ground was hard as a rock. And they could not get a spade or a shovel to go into it. But Uncle Harry came up with the idea. He said, here's what let's do. One of us take a mattock and we can chop this dirt till we get some loose. And then another one could take a shovel and throw it out. And then we chop some more loose and then throw it out. And they figured if they kept doing that without stopping, within about 100 years, they'd have a swimming hole. Well, Uncle Frank was chopping with the mattock, Uncle Harry was, and Uncle Frank was shoveling with the shovel and talking. Now, my daddy said Uncle Frank was born without a lid to go on his mouth. And he talked all the time. He woke himself up in the morning talking in his sleep already. And then he'd talk while he was eating. He had to keep putting food back in his mouth because he'd talk and blow it out again. And then at night, he'd stop talking just long enough to go to sleep. Then he'd talk in his sleep all night. And my dad said when Uncle Frank was talking, it consumed his entire mentality. Are you getting the picture? Uncle Harry's chopping with the mattock. Uncle Frank is shoveling and talking. And one time when Uncle Harry came back with the mattock, at the same time, Uncle Frank bent down with the shovel. And the mattock came down and hit him right in the crown of the head, and the blood just spurted out, and he started squalling, I'm killed, I'm killed, I'm killed, I'm killed. And his brother said, you're not killed, because if you were killed, you couldn't holler like that. Well, they all went running toward the house. Imagine my poor grandmother. She's just in there washing the dishes, and she hears a great big noise, and she opens the door, and coming around that rock, here comes one of her boys with blood squirting out of his head, hollering, I'm killed, and right behind him comes another one with a shovel, and then another one with a mattock. She got the dish rag and washed it out in cold water and held it on his head, and then washed it out again, and she kept on. Finally, it stopped bleeding. And she looked at his head and she said, so that's what the bone looks like. Well, the trouble is just now starting. Because, see, they lived 16 miles from town on an old dirt road, no vehicles, nothing but 2 farm horses. So my grandmother figured that, as usual, she had to deal with it. So she got out her straight razor. She was the one who always shaved my granddaddy. It was her straight razor. She would strop it all up, make lather and lather up and shave him. So she got out her straight razor and she stropped it up and she shaved off all the hair around where Uncle Frank's head was cut open. And while she was doing that, she got a pot of water boiling on the stove, and she dropped something in that pot of water and let it boil. And then she got the other brothers to hold Frank down. And while they were holding him down, she fished in that water and fished out what she was boiling, which was a big needle and thread. And while they held him down, she sewed up his head. Well, then she said to my granddaddy, she said, I've never done this before, so I don't know if I got it right. It might need to be done all over again. You better take him to town and find a doctor and see if I did it right. And my granddaddy got Frank on the horse, and they rode all the way into town. Their oldest brother, Uncle Grover, was 16 years older. He already lived in town. They went to his house, spent the night, and the next morning, he took them to the doctor's house. The doctor checked Uncle Frank's head. And he asked my granddaddy 3 questions. Did this boy's mama sew up his head? Yes, she did. Second question. Did she boil the needle and thread first? I don't know how she knew to do that. Last question. Does she make quilts? He said, well, yes, she does. Why? The doctor said, well, I would have put in about 6 stitches. I believe she gave him 30. Little tiny close-up stitches. The doctor said she did such a neat little job, it might not even leave a scar when it heals up. Then they pulled out this brown glass jug that said iodine on it. And they painted his head, and he started squalling again. I'm killed, I'm killed, I'm killed, because it was just burning him up. Finally, they got back home, and they got all the way home, and Uncle Frank finally looked in the mirror. He got kind of tickled. He had a big old swarp of his hair shaved off. He was sewed up by his mama right down the middle. Now had a stripe painted on top of it. He thought, I'm so funny looking, they won't make me go to church looking like this. Guess what? They did. And my daddy said there hadn't been that much laughter at the Methodist church for 25 years. Well, when it was all over, my granddaddy gathered those boys up. He said, now, boys, let's talk about this a little bit. You know there ought to be some punishment. But you know what I say? If you learn something, that's better than being punished. So if each of you boys can tell me one thing you learned, there won't be any punishment. He said, Harry, you're the oldest, so you go first. Uncle Harry said, okay, here's what I learned. We don't need no swimming hole. He said, that's good. Said, Moody, you go next. What did you learn? Uncle Moody says, if you ever need to get a whole lot of blood out of somebody right quick, hit them right smack in the top of the head. My granddad said, well, I guess that's right. He said, Frank, what did you learn? And Uncle Frank says, if 2 people are working and one of them's got a shovel and one of them's got a mattock, you better be the one that's got the mattock. And he said to my daddy, little Joe, what did you learn? And my daddy said, I didn't have to learn anything. Because since Frank thought it up, I knew it was a bad idea. But if I grow up and have children, I'm going to tell them their Uncle Frank will be the best teacher they'll ever have. Because they need to ask him questions, watch what he does, listen to what he says, ask him questions, watch what he does, listen to what he says, and then don't do any of it. You know the magical thing about a story like that? You got to meet my Uncle Frank. And he has been absent from this earth for 40 years. More than that, almost 50 years. Yeah, 50 years. But in story, he's still alive. And that's why we love doing this. Because when we tell stories of the people we loved when we were growing up, our children and grandchildren still get to meet them and know who they were. Well, out of those 13 children, as I said, my dad was number 8. And in 1920, my grandfather, who was born in 1850, my grandfather died. My dad was 19 years old, unmarried, still at home. All his older siblings were already married, grown up, and gone off into their lives. So my dad, being the oldest one who was still at home, he ended up inheriting 5 little brothers and sisters to raise, plus the care of his mother and his unmarried aunt, Aunt Laura, way before Social Security, way before life insurance. And so he spent about the next 20 years raising those children. He sent 4 of the 5 of them to college, supported the 2 older women, and he thought he would never get married. And when he was 43, he met my mother, who was a 25-year-old school teacher. And they ran off and got married. The reason they ran off was because my dad was almost the same age as his new mother-in-law. They had to go hide out for a little while. Well, by the time my brother Joe and I were born, our dad was old enough to be a grandfather. So we kind of grew up with a grandfather and a mother. And it was fun because we knew exactly how to work which one of them, depending on what we needed to get out of them along the way. We would do something and my mother would say, "You wait till your daddy gets home." I think, okay, he'll like this. And then we'd tell him what we did, and he would tell us about something he and his brothers did that was way worse than anything we'd ever thought of. It was good. Yeah. Well, he developed punishment. He perfected punishment. If my brother and I committed what my dad considered to be a misdemeanor, we got a little short spanking that lasted 3 minutes, and we forgot about it in 5 minutes. But if we committed what he considered to be a felony, he would act like he didn't know about it. And then we'd start to worry. Does he know or not? Why doesn't he say something about it? Is it just wait until Mama's not here to kill us? What's going to happen? Maybe he doesn't really know. And then time would pass, and I'd think, he must not really know. I must have gotten away with it. And then we'd hear these terrible words. "Boys, let me tell you a little story." No, don't tell us a story. Please don't tell us a story. Just beat us, don't tell us a story. Well, let me tell you about one of those occasions. My dad worked at First National Bank right over in Waynesville, North Carolina. He was the loan department. There were 3 men who worked at the bank, and they would take turns every day, one to the other of them. They would take turns being the last one to leave and closing everything. So every 3rd day, my dad was the closer and the last person to leave. In those days, the bank was open from 9 to 1. And then it closed for the day. That was banker's hours. Because, see, there was no separate bookkeeping department. What happened after 1 was the tellers became the bookkeepers. My dad became one of the bookkeepers. And they entered all their work from the morning, and when they balanced, then they could go home. So sometimes he might be home at 4:30. They had balanced. Sometimes he'd come home at 5 o'clock to eat supper and milk our milk cow and go back and try to find the error. "Lucille, we're out 27 cents. I know it's an inversion because it's divisible by 9. My mother would say, "Can't you just put in 27 cents and come home, Joe?" "No, you can't do that. The bank examiners are coming." So that's what our world was like. So see, after 1 o'clock, my mother knew if she wanted to go somewhere without me, which was often, like the beauty parlor, try on clothes she wasn't going to buy, the doctor's office, she would leave me at the bank with my daddy. I loved it. He would get a big Diebold adding machine, kind of with a big crank on the side of it, and he'd give me the little Waynesville telephone book and tell me that the bank needed all the phone numbers added up. And I'd go through adding all the 4-digit phone numbers, adding up 4 phone numbers, till I had a big tape running way across the wall, starting up the wall. And then it'd be time to go, and he'd take that tape, and he'd fold it up and staple it to the top of that page in the phone book and mark how far I got so I could start with that like a subtotal and keep adding the next time. Every time I went, just keep adding up the phone numbers in the phone book. Well, I was there one day, and it was my daddy's turn to leave. Everybody else had gone. We went around, we checked to be sure the back door was locked and the big bar was down across it. All the windows locked because they didn't have air conditioning. The windows were just open in the nice weather time. And then the last thing my dad had to do was the back of the door of the big Mosler vault was glass, and you open that door, and there were 3 time clocks in there. And he had to wind those time clocks and set them for 8:30 in the morning. So that way, even if somebody had the combination, that safe would not open until after 8:30 in the morning. Somebody could hold him up by gunpoint, take him in there in the night, and he still couldn't open that safe because of the time clocks. And it took a few minutes to do that, so while he was winding the time clocks, I was out of sight. And I could pursue my favorite hobby, snooping and prowling around. That day I was prowling around the desk that belonged to a man named Mr. Jack Way. Mr. Way didn't work at the bank. He was the mayor of Waynesville. And he didn't have an office. He had a desk in the bank lobby. And that's where he came every day and conducted the business of town. And he always had a big fish bowl on his desk that was full of chewing gum and candy. I did not do it. Because that day there was something much more interesting on that desk. That day there was about a half-empty pack of Cavalier cigarettes. I didn't do that either. Because when you're about 8 years old, you are not responsible for what your hands do. They just go where they want to go, and you have to follow them. And one of my hands picked up that pack of cigarettes and shook one of them out on top of that desk. And my other hand picked it up and put it in my shirt pocket, and I had no way to get it back out. And right then, Daddy said, "Let's go," and we headed home. Well, as soon as we got home, I got my little brother Joe, and I said, "Let's go out to the barn loft." We played in the barn loft all the time. See, we had a milk cow and chickens and a garden in case the depression came back. And so we headed out to the barn, and my mother said, "Don't stay long because supper's going to be ready pretty soon." And we got up in the barn loft, and I pulled out that cigarette. And I stuck it in my mouth. And I started talking like Humphrey Bogart in an old black and white movie. From here on, everything's my brother's fault. Because he said, "Smoke it, smoke it, smoke it." I had no idea how to smoke it, but I was showing off, and once you start, you can't stop, can you? So I got out the matches that I always had in my pocket when I was 8 years old. And I struck a match, and just as I held it up to the end of that cigarette, I didn't know whether to suck in or blow out. But I held the match up to the end of that cigarette, and right then, we heard my daddy come into milk. We heard him because he sang when he went to milk. He left the house singing, 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 because he said, you know, it calms the cow down. She gives her milk down a lot better if you sing to her. And here he came. We could hear him. He was singing, "For his eye is on the sparrow, and I know he watches me." My little brother said, "Hide it, hide it, hide it." And I got that cigarette. It was kind of, just burned on the end. And I squashed it, and I stuck it down in the crack between 2 boards in the floor of that barn loft roof. I thought it was a solid place I didn't know it went all the way through. And just as our daddy walked under the barn to come in to milk, that cigarette and all that hay trash and dust came right down in front of him, straight down in front of his face. He didn't see it. He must have been temporarily blind, or the sun got in his eyes. He didn't even look up. He had no idea we were up there. And we watched down through that crack while he milked. He got the bucket he brought. He got out of it the wet rag he had. He washed off Helen, our cow's udder. He sat down and he started milking. I thought, go on, get it over with. Go on, get through, get through. Took him forever to milk that cow. Well, finally he left, and my little brother and I went down. We went way around by the chicken house. We went way around the garden. We came in the other side of the house, and our mother said, oh, there you are, boys. I was about to call you. Supper is ready. And we sat down and proceeded to eat supper. Nothing was said. Our daddy didn't pay any attention to us in this world. He just ate his supper the way he always did. Supper was over, and my mother said, boys, we better go to bed because, you know, it's a school day tomorrow. And my little brother Joe said, I don't want to go to bed. I don't get tired. And Daddy said, well, let's see. If you don't want to go to bed, how about if I tell you a little story? No. Our mother said, well, it can't be long because it's a school night. He said, it won't be long. It'll be just right. Now, he was always telling stories about when he and his brothers were little. And he said, did I ever tell you about the time when Harry and Frank burned little Joe Medford's barn down? My mother said, I never heard that story. He said, it's a good story. I believe I'll tell it tonight. He said, Harry and Frank were about as old as Donald and Joe are now. And you know, Daddy was running for the legislature, and one Sunday afternoon, a man came all the way out to the farm to talk to him about politics. And they sat in the kitchen and they talked all afternoon, and when that man left, he left a pack of Camel cigarettes on our kitchen table. Mom and Daddy didn't see them because by then Frank and Harry had them. And they went outside with those cigarettes looking for a place to see if they could figure out how to smoke one. They thought about hiding up in the barn loft. But when they thought about it, they were afraid maybe Daddy would go to milk and catch them. So they didn't go up in our barn loft. They went up the hill behind the house. They went through the fence. They went down the other side. They climbed up in little Joe Medford's barn loft. And they managed to light up a cigarette, and they were passing it back and forth, puffing on it. Well, what they hadn't thought about happened. Little Joe came out to milk his cow. And Uncle Frank said to Harry, hide it, hide it, hide it. And Harry mashed that cigarette, and he stuck it down in the crack between two boards up in that barn loft. And they jumped out the back, and they went running home. And little Joe saw them run off. He didn't know what they were doing up there, but he saw them. He knew who they were. Well, boys, he finished milking, and he went back to the house and went to bed. And boys, way in the night, they hadn't mashed that cigarette all the way out. And it came to life. And the hay trash caught fire with the little breeze coming up through there. And the old boards caught fire. And it's a good thing it wasn't wintertime and there weren't any cows in there. That whole barn caught fire, and because it was nighttime, nobody knew it was on fire till it came through the roof. And it burned to the ground. And in about 3 days, little Joe and Daddy got the truth out about what happened. And Daddy had to build little Joe a new barn and pay for it. What do you boys think about that story? My little brother said, can we go to bed now? I just got real tired. And I looked at my mother, and she's looking like, what's he telling that for? She had no idea in this world why he told us that story. But we knew that he knew, and he'd given us one chance. You think we'd have two? So here's the thing. If you ever have to punish children or grandchildren, here's the thing I learned to do. If they commit a misdemeanor, just give them a little spanking and get it over with. But if they commit a felony, tell them a story. It'll put them in therapy for years. They'll never forget it. They'll tell their children and their grandchildren and their great-grand, and it'll just go on forever. Well, let's come up to a little bit older age story. I entered Davidson College in 1962 after I was graduated from high school that year. And the next year, 1963, when I went back for my sophomore year, there'd been a construction project. We didn't know about it when we left in May. It was a surprise. They'd excavated under the end of the main classroom building, built what was sort of like a basement that opened out at ground level on that end, because IBM was leasing to colleges mainframe computers with the hopes that when the lease ran out, the school would buy the computer and keep it. And there we were with this new gigantic, room-size mainframe computer and all kinds of miraculous promises about what it could do. They said things like this, when you register for classes, you won't even need a schedule. You just register for exactly the classes you want. Everybody can register for exactly the classes they want. And then that magical computer can come up with a schedule that will make that all work, and everybody will get exactly every class they want. You think that worked? No. All kinds of things like that were talked about. In fact, the head of student counseling and the head of the computer lab came up with a program in which they would enter in somebody's high school grades and their SAT scores, and the computer would predict what their grade point average would be. And anybody whose grade point average was 0.5 below what the computer predicted was going to get an underachiever letter. And I'm a proud member of a group of 82 people who received an underachiever letter from the computer, which turned out fine because the head of counseling, who was about 45 years old, whose wife was about 25 years old and very blonde, his wife, about 2 weeks later, ran off with the assistant football coach, and we wrote him an underachiever letter. Yeah. It was wonderful. Yeah. Well, some kids who were students of Princeton, where they also had a mainframe computer, came up with this program that they started selling, to college students all over the place, everywhere. It was a program called 5 Dates for $5. And you could go over and you could pay your $5, and then you got in the mail this huge, long, pages and pages and pages and pages questionnaire with little punch holes in it, so it could go through and be evaluated by the computer. Questions where you could lie about yourself. You could tell all these kinds of things that you wanted your potential date to know about you, on and on and on and on and on, building a fake personality all the way through. And then you sent that in, and later on you got back a letter matching you up with 5 perfect computer dates. Now, Davidson at that time was not a co-ed school, so we were going to all be matched up with girls from other campuses all around. The guarantee was they would not be 100 miles away. My best friend was Bill Jones from Talladega, Alabama, and we went over and we signed up and we got the questions, we filled it all out, and Bill and I waited and waited to get back our 5 each perfect dates. Well, the letters came and we opened it up, and Bill and I were looking at them, and all of a sudden we noticed something. Each one of us had been matched up with a date, 2 different women, but they were both at Pfeiffer College, a little Methodist school about an hour from where we were, just right over there in North Carolina. And so we decided the thing to do was we would see if we could line up dates with our two perfectly matched up computer companions on the same Sunday afternoon, and then we would go over there and see what happened. And the plan was made. We got over there to Pfeiffer, and my date was in one dormitory, and Bill's date was in another dormitory. And we'd taken my car, and we parked it around on the side. And I went in, and I told the person there at the desk, who I was looking for. And the person immediately looked up and said, "Oh, she has a good personality." I didn't know what that was a code for. But when my date came down the stairs, I want to be fair with descriptions. Her friends said, "She just has big bones." We started out for a walk. She was considerably stronger than I was. Yeah. She began to tell me about how she was an only child, and she grew up on a farm, farming with her daddy. And he had sent her off to college with hopes that she would meet a husband who would come home with her and farm with her daddy. I wasn't getting real interested in that. We were walking out toward a little pond on the back of the campus, and she started telling me about what her favorite things to do were on the farm. One of her she loved to plow all day with a tractor up and down the field all day. That was one of her favorite things to do. But another favorite thing was they'd take the front end loader on the tractor, and her daddy would lift up the side of the corn crib, and with a shotgun she'd shoot the rats under the corn crib when he lifted the edge of it up with the front end loader on the tractor. The only thing that was more fun than that, and she had her hand in her pocket, the only thing that was more fun than that was castrating hogs. And she had her knife right there in her hand when she told me that. And I was getting trembly. And we turned a little corner around that pond, and she looked down at me and she said, "I never would have guessed I'd have met my future husband on a computer date." And I thought right then, "Lady, you didn't today." And I said, "I'm so sorry. Whatever I ate has just hit me right in the stomach. My stomach is all upset. I'm going to have to kindly tell you goodbye." And I ran for it. I ran all the way back. I thought, I'll just sit in the car and wait till Bill gets back. I went around that corner. Bill's already in the car. He was sitting there with that list of computer dates. He was tearing it up in little pieces. I said, "Don't throw that away. We got to do something with that list to be sure it's gone." And we got back over to the campus, and I tore mine up too, and we burned it in a metal trash can to be sure it couldn't come back to life. Well, many of you knew my late wife, Merle. Merle died 6 years ago, and so many friends were so kind after that, and so kind in caring for her memory and caring for me. And after some months had passed, they began to say to me, "You need to come back to life because only one of you died and it's not you." They said, "There are ways to meet people these days." All right. You can go on the computer and you can find different groups of different people. You can even find groups, your age even. You can go on there. And they did not truly understand the depths of what I meant when I said, "I've tried computer dating, and I just don't think that's exactly for me." Well, thank you for being here today. I'll be back at 2 o'clock. That show's sold out at 2 today, sorry. But 7:30 at the library tonight, we'll have a whole bunch of stories from childhood then that'll be different from anything that you've heard. I'll tell different things all week. And then tomorrow, 2 shows here at 11 and 2. And then we'll be on the way with the festival. So travel carefully and safely, and I hope to see you again before the week's over. So long.